Hear me. We're very excited tonight to welcome Charlie Clark. I don't really need to introduce him because I have a feeling that many of you know him personally or have read his column. I work at One More Page Books, and I can tell you this book has been flying off the shelves at our store. Before I came over here, I had to pick them all up to bring them to make sure that we would have enough. But I know we're in for a really interesting, fun, and kind of quirky evening, hearing some of the odd things and informative things and really wonderful people that live here in Arlington. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Clark.
Okay. Thanks so much, Eileen. So we're going to have a two-way talk tonight. I am going to speak for a while, and I will probably read one or two selections from the book, and then talk a little more, but I do look forward to not just questions, but anecdotes. I always get a big kick out of it, and there's so much in everybody else's heads about our wonderful county of Arlington that I would love to open it up for that a little bit later. So I wanted to start with a pop quiz. How many people here know where Wonders Crossroads is? All right, we got 1, 2, 3. Pretty good. Okay, well, you all are black belts in Arlington trivia. Wonders Crossroads is the intersection of Glebe Road and Lee Highway. And it was a farm in the latter 19th century. And the reason I mention it is that there's a historic sign right there in front of the Wells Fargo, right where the Optimist Club sells Christmas trees every year. And my theory is that very few people stop and read those historic signs. And I'm guilty of that for much of my life, too. So I've gotten in the habit in recent years, since I've been writing this column in the Falls Church paper, of pulling over and reading them. And 3 of them ended up in this book. So I thought that was a good lesson. Since I began writing the column, which was December of 2010, which means I've written something like 170 of them by now, every week. I've built a collection of Arlington books, and many of which you all have too. I'm sure I have the Eleanor Lee Templeman book, Arlington Vignettes, and I have the Cornelia Rose book, which is a slightly more scholarly history of Arlington, and then I have the Nan and Ross Netherton Pictorial History of Arlington from the 80s. And I have a lot of smaller, more specialized ones. But they're all disciplined. They're all something you could look things up in, maybe chronologically. And when I was trying to figure out how to do a book on Arlington, it wasn't just trying to do greatest hits for my column. I was trying to assemble something, and I had a little help from my daughter, who's a wordsmith as well. I wanted to get something that would add up to a portrait of Arlington and that would cater to different populations. Arlington is a slightly strange beast. You know, it really doesn't have a center the way some towns do, the way maybe Old Town Alexandria is regarded as a center. I think at one point I described Arlington as the yard sale capital of the Eastern Seaboard, for lack of anything more universal. But so I ended up combining history with some personal history and boyhood memories, a little bit of baby boomer nostalgia, and then a taste of personalities in Arlington, and then a taste of the public policy spats that erupt in Arlington and that are handled in the very civilized Arlington way. And I tried to pick columns that had a shelf life and that would reveal a little bit about how Arlington works, and hopefully, even if the stories themselves have been resolved, that they still have some staying power. And I did a lot of nice research through the Arlington Historical Society. They've been very supportive of me. I'm grateful to them. They're a lot of them in that fine group are a little more hardcore historians than I am. I'm a journalist. I do what I sometimes call drive-by history. And a lot of those fine people have the patience to give up their sunny Saturdays, to pour through files and documents and put together, maybe more accurate but slightly dull or slightly, you're uncertain if you're ever going to be able to publish this, But I've taken advantage of a lot of their work, and they've given me some leeway, too. When I first started writing for them, it was way back in the late 90s. I tried to sort of introduce the journalistic approach, fewer footnotes, more anecdotes, and more recent history. I did things on the founding of H.B. Woodlawn and on the American Nazi Party in Arlington and on the motorcycle gang shootout, all of which I've spoken about here before. And I think it was a revelation to all of us that something so recent could be classified as history, but that's part of growing old. So let me give a quick personal bio, and then I'll read a selection, and then we'll talk some more. I was born George Washington Hospital downtown, but my parents immediately moved to Irving Street in Clarendon. I have no memory of that house, but I have pictures of it till it was torn down last year, redeveloped. It's right next to Frank Haltewanger's house. He's the principal of H.B. Woodlawn, and across the street from Al Eisenberg's house, too. My parents moved over to Cherrydale, where I lived for 6 years. Went to Cherrydale Elementary School, first and part of second grade. Then my parents moved to Rivercrest by Chain Bridge, where I went to James Madison Elementary School for 5.5 years. Then I went to Williamsburg Junior High back then. And then I went to Yorktown, graduated in 1971. There's a few of my Yorktown mates here tonight, which I'm pleased to see. So I just wanted you to have, and then I went away for college, traveled, settled in Alexandria, met my wife, and I never knew what hit me after that. But we came back to Arlington in 1993, and we've settled in the East Falls Church neighborhood. And if you read the book, you might pick up a slight bias towards North Arlington, towards East Falls Church, towards baby boomers, whatever, but ignore it. It's we do our best. Okay, so I'd like to do one reading, which I hope will speak to different generations and that has some real history in it, too. This is called Roots at Arlington Hall. Whenever I drive past Arlington Hall, I'm reminded that if it did not exist, neither would I. It was there at the intersection of Arlington Boulevard and George Mason Drive that my parents met during World War II. Today, the 100-acre complex is a fenced-off home to the Army National Guard Readiness Center and the George P. Schultz National Foreign Affairs Training Center. But this prime location has a more intriguing history, encompassing debutantes and spies of both local and global import. Arlington Hall began as the county's sole private school, built in 1927 as a junior college for women. Its handsome yellow brick colonial structure with 6 columns housed a high school, classrooms, a gym, an indoor and outdoor equestrian arena for 200 students. Instruction for females of the SMART set included music, art, drama, home economics, secretarial skills, and physical education, according to Nan and Ross Netherton's Pictorial History of Arlington. But its horses were the main attraction, according to the Smithsonian American History Museum director, John Gray, whose mother studied there in the mid-1930s. We grew up with great photographs of her on the fiercest horses, jumping in the ring, and a few pictures of the students dressed to the nines for their dinner, Gray told me. Mother continued to ride with the riding instructor from Arlington Hall out on the circuit. Through the Great Depression, forced the school into bankruptcy. It survived under nonprofit trusteeship until 1942. And that's when the federal government took over and set up the U.S. Army Signal Corps' Signals Intelligence Service, tasked with breaking the Japanese code. Renamed Arlington Hall Station, the site hosted many young intelligence officers and linguists who'd been summoned to Washington for the war effort. Among them were a Yale history major newly commissioned as an Army lieutenant, my father, and a Newcomb, Tulane University, language major, my mother. The project was so secret, my dad wrote in a letter recently unearthed by my sister, that when he asked recruiters to describe the actual work, they couldn't tell us. Mom described the difficulty of code breaking on camera in the 2007 WETA-produced documentary Homefront, World War II in Washington, in which she declared crash course learning of Japanese to be a tall order. Both my future parents used their time at Arlington Hall to meet people from unfamiliar backgrounds and to enjoy nightlife with eligible singles. Just a couple of years ago, I tracked down their first apartment, walking distance away at Fillmore Gardens. I carried a black and white snapshot of the couple from 1944, and I invited a befuddled current resident to gawk at the photo of my folks taken half a century earlier on his front stoop. When the war ended, Arlington Hall continued as a national security hub. The drama of a Soviet spy named Bill Wiesband at the site was not exposed until the 1990s. It served as headquarters for the National Security Agency, U.S. Army and Air Force security organizations, and later parts of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Today, the beautiful Arlington Hall main building on the National Register of Historic Places is run by the State Department for its Foreign Service Institute. Every year it offers 600 courses in 70 languages to some 100,000 enrollees from more than 40 agencies. For security reasons, my request for a tour was denied, but I still contentedly drive by. Thank you. So another theme that I hope is captured in the sweep of the book, but again, without much discipline. That's the way we non-professional historians operate. But it captures a little, I hope, the sweep of change in Arlington. And one of the essays that I thought embodied that the most is the one on Hall's Hill. Because when I was growing up here in the 50s and 60s, white families considered a dangerous neighborhood that you seldom entered. And I took the Arlington walking tour, which was a wonderful program run by Lauren Hassel. And we had about 100 of us walking all through the neighborhood, and I was just astonished at the multiracial tranquility there was there now, and all sorts of new homes. And I also learned a whole lot about the geography of Hall's Hill, the fence that once divided it from the nearby neighborhoods, which is remnants of which are still there, and some of the famous people that used to live in the neighborhood, and the fact that when Arlington Hospital was built, when 1940s maybe, blacks who lived 200 feet away were not permitted as patients. So I recommend that walking tour of Hall's Hill. The other thing I did in the book to try and give it some durability was I researched carefully, and thanks for the internet, compilations of Arlington celebrities, some trivia there, and I tried to fact check them as best I could and tried to produce what I hope is the definitive roundup of the famous actors, the famous athletes, the famous musicians. Then I did lists of vanished businesses. I have the movie theaters that are no longer here, a lot of the retail places, some of which photographs I used. Arlington's other cemeteries, I have a column. You can find about 12 lesser-known cemeteries in Arlington and how to find them. And espionage in Arlington, which I totally ripped off from the CIA historian David Robarge, whom I've heard speak several times. But he gives a great talk, which I covered once, about 3 or 4 major espionage episodes that unfolded in Arlington. One of the most popular columns, for some reason, but it really warms the cockles of my heart, is the one I did on Jim Morrison, the singer of the Doors group that dominated the pop charts in the summer of love, 1967, with his song "Light My Fire." And the reason he's close to my heart is that not only was I a fan, but the first piece of journalism I ever published and was paid for was in 1972, was my visit to Jim Morrison's grave in Paris. He's buried at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, and this had not gotten much coverage at the time, and so I interviewed the groundskeeper who told me that these French kids would come at midnight and scream and play guitars and howl, and so it made a slightly scandalous story. So I sent it back to the Washington Daily News. How many remember the Washington Daily News? All right. It was a tabloid, and afternoon used to be quite a good pickup, and the Washington Star, it was folded into the Washington Star, I think in 1972. I think I remember the first issue where it said the Star News, and then it went out of business, God knows, sometime in the late 70s. Okay, then I'd like to read one more column that deals with a vanished business in Arlington, and that I hope captures some of the narcissistic baby boomer lifestyle. Okay, this one's called Buddy the Mover Man. A death notice from a memorable moving man made the rounds in November 2012 among a slice of my Arlington boyhood pals. Arthur Buddy Fry of Spotsylvania County, who died in June 2012 at 68, may never have known his impact on the lives of suburban teens back in the 1970s at what then was an Arlington institution known as Newlands Transfer. The emails flew 40 years after Buddy and the other furniture estimators, truck drivers, packers, and warehousemen gave our gang of college help our first adventures in blue-collar work. My brother, sister, and a dozen-plus friends spent summers at Newlands at North Nelson Street, the yard still visible off I-66 at Quincy Street, between Hayes Playground and the vanished Scoremore Bowling Alley. We packed household goods and humped hide-a-beds up walkboards for hourly wages that, memories differ, ranged from $1.56 to $2.25. We rode around the Beltway to homes of military families for moves dispatched from the old Cameron Station in Alexandria. My friend Willie swore he would have worked there for free just to build character and nobility. Winnie recalls feeling like a voyeur while packing others' belongings that, for some Newlands veterans, included dirty dishes. Most of us were hired by the gruff owner, Harry Earl Newland, Jr. Steve recalled how Harry Earl would come out of his office, go to the shed, and holler at us for standing around and not cleaning up. But then he would look at Steve privately and wink. My sister Martha remembers Harry's impatience when some callow employee couldn't get a truck running. The boss removed his jacket and applied his diamond-ringed fingers to make the engine roar. My friend Dickie, who in college folklore class wrote a 50-page paper on Newlands, recalled the Saturday he and pal Randy were driven to Harry's Fairfax home in a flatbed truck. They picked up a backhoe to spread topsoil. His wife made us tuna salad sandwiches for a 15-minute lunch, Dickie remembers. We went back to the office, and Harry told us he was going to fill in our time clock cards. He docked the travel time and the tuna fish eating time. I can't take credit for that joke. It's a good joke. Much more approachable was Newland's son, Harry Earl III, called Butch. One guy in our college crowd threw a beer party and invited the whole Newlands crew to his parents' home. Butch was the only professional to show. Buddy Fry, as James recalled, once passed out a memo declaring guaranteed vacation time for all long-term employees, allegedly signed by Harry Earl, though he delayed giving the boss his own copy. Buddy was a silver-tongued salesman with customers. My brother recalls Buddy mocking him for believing that the 1969 moonwalk really happened. My friend Donnie recalls getting in trouble and hearing Buddy say, "Let old Bud take care of it." Many of us worked during the floods from 1972's Hurricane Agnes. A black crew leader who couldn't get home to D.C. spent that night on a cot in our Arlington home. Newlands was still going in 1993 when I booked a local move. Eventually, its property was taken over by technology contractor System Planning Corp., and Newlands shrunk to a moving supplies office run by Butch near the Landmark Shopping Center. Butch died in 2004, and his father in 2010. Today, the old Newlands yard belongs to Arlington Public Schools. I treasure my education from both owners. If you get the book, you'll see I do have a little rundown of controversies in the county. The streetcar figures heavily. I do not take a position on the streetcar. I do enjoy talking about it, though. I talk about some others, the homeless shelter they're about to build at Courthouse Square, and I talk about the decibel checking equipment they used at the Westover Beer Garden to protect the neighbors from illicit Saturday night electrified music. I thought I would mention a couple of columns that I didn't get a totally positive reaction to, but I'm a big boy. There's an essay on Bolston and how the high-rises have come to dominate the skyline, and not always in the most attractive way. And a couple people have accused me of not being an architecture critic, which I'll acknowledge. But one day I was sitting in the barber chair in Falls Church, and the guy in the chair next to me said, "Are you the guy that wrote that column about Ballston?" I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, I designed that building there. I designed the Westin Hotel across the street." He's talking about the Virginia Tech building, you know. So I tried to assure him that he did a beautiful job. If you're riding on Glebe Road south and you can see Macy's ahead of you, the way those silver buildings, the new ones, turn around, I think that's great. I'm really talking about the buildings a little bit further to the left that just look like giant higgledy-piggledy, cakes or something. Then the other one that I hope wasn't misinterpreted, I have an essay here on the cotillion dances. How many here participated in cotillion, either as parents or as dancers? Good for you all. Well, the column's about how on a Saturday morning I had to give up my basketball practice and put on a clip-on bow tie and go learn how to do the foxtrot, to Squaresville music, like Autumn Leaves and Tea for Two, with this combo up front, and the girls all had to wear their white gloves, and we had to learn how to fetch them their punch and everything. So I had a fun time recalling that and interviewing some friends, and I interviewed Mrs. Courtney, Audrey Courtney, who's still living. She's in the Green Spring retirement community, and her husband, Joe Courtney, and he's going to show up in another story I'll tell in just a minute. He showed up. She gave me a good interview about how cotillion was organized, which I would have had no idea, being a 12-year-old at the time. And when the column came out, it occurred to me that some of my hyperbolic sarcasm about how traumatized I was by this experience really sort of went over her head, and I don't really blame her, And it occurred to me that, the World War II generation, many of whom are here in the audience, you all did your level best to raise the baby boomers, and we had a different agenda. I think that there was very little hope that when the Beatles had just hit in 1964 that we were going to learn the foxtrot and go to debut parties. And but I just am so glad. I'd like to thank the World War II generation for trying to share their culture with us. I really appreciate it. Couple more. In the book, there are at least 2 photographs. I tried to use quirky photographs rather than just straight journalistic photos. You interview the county manager, here's the county manager, not that kind of photo. There's 2 photos of things that no longer exist. Well, actually 3 if you count the Monument store that folded about 2 years ago, right when the book was ready to come out. The one in Clarendon moved out to Vienna. That was the oldest business in Arlington for a while, went back to like 1890s or something. But I have a photograph of the Clarendon Central Methodist Church sign that appeared when the government had shut down. And you'll see that they had a fun little message about God doesn't care about shutdowns or whatever. And of course that sign is gone, but I got the picture of it before it left. And then I have a column that was based on a typographical error on a street sign that a friend of mine pointed out. And I used it as an excuse to call up the county sign makers, which is one of the privileges of being a columnist. You get to call up and ask these nosy questions, and they'll put you through. And this guy says, "Well, where is it?" And I said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you that because you'll fix it before my column comes out." So when he boasted, he says, "We can fix that in 2 hours." So I said, "Okay." The column came out on Thursday morning. It may have been out online a little bit earlier. And I was walking to the Metro at about 10 in the morning, and there was this crew fixing the sign. You can see that. And then I thought I would tell one more little story that almost wasn't. It's the most absurd juxtaposition on the cover to see Colonel Mosby and the Yorktown football team in the mud in the fall of 1970. But there's a story behind this, and I wouldn't have brought it up if I hadn't been in this very room about 2 years ago when they had an excellent Historical Society event on the history of Washington Lee High School. Some of you were probably there. They had representatives in the class of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s all through speaking. So when my friend George Dodge, who's an author and active in the Historical Society, when his turn to speak about the 70s, he says the highlight of his high school years was the football game against Yorktown in the mud where W&L won, and there was this rumors that the coaches had purposely watered down the football field. And so So my mouth just dropped because he had no idea that I played in that game and that we talked about that, for years to come. But we eventually moved on, But what happened during the game is that a Washington Post photographer, there's about 10,000 people in the W&L Stadium. The reason was that Yorktown was undefeated, and we were 9-0, and all we had to do was knock off this piddly little W&L, and we would go to the regionals and all that. We lost the game 12-0 in the mud and didn't even win the district. But not that I'm bitter or anything. But so at some point during the game, through no fault of mine, this Washington Post photographer snapped this picture, and it is a nicely composed picture. I give him credit. It was never published, but Mr. Courtney, whose wife, who did Cotillion, I mentioned earlier, he approached the photographer later and secured the negative and made several copies, a circulation of about 5, and he sent it to several of us who were in the picture. My father had duplicates made, and he put it in his office, and it stayed there for years. I still have a copy in my office, too. And so when it came time so then I wrote this column after George Dodge and reintroduced the subject after 40 years of dormancy. And I sent the anecdote out to a lot of my classmates and teammates, and they immediately weighed in with all this debate about whether the coaches purposely watered down the field. That was fun. So it made an easy column. And then I got a contractor to publish his book, and they wanted photographs. So suddenly, this is like a series of about 7 flukes coming together. The publisher wants pictures, and there's a chance for this one to finally be published. And I got the original negative from the Courtney family, and there it came. So anyway, I'm about to open it up for questions and comments. I thought I would just end with a little note about how I write the column. The Falls Church paper, it has about 40,000 circulation, I think, mostly in Falls Church, but some in Arlington, 3,000 or 4,000 in Arlington. They have about 30 drop-off points at CVS and Metro and Safeway. And it comes out online. I'm usually Tuesday night, print edition Thursday morning. And I usually pick a topic by about Wednesday, and I make some inquiries by email or phone, and get a couple of facts or quotes nailed down, and then Sunday afternoon, no matter how tired I am or how much I'd rather watch the Redskins or something, I sit down and bang out a column, and then my wife helps me proofread it on Monday night, and we send it in. I don't ever seem to run out of ideas. I have an ongoing list of future ideas, some evergreen, some breaking news, and I get a lot of good ideas from readers, so I'm happy to take suggestions from you. And I just want to say that it was a big stroke of luck to get the column and a big stroke of luck to get the book out, and I consider it a big privilege. Thank you very much. So I think she has a microphone here. If you have questions or anecdotes, comments, please feel free. Yeah. Okay, right here. Yeah.
Thanks. First of all, I want to thank you for that opening article you described about Arlington Hall.
Oh, good.
I learned so much. My mother, like your mother, was one of those young women, and I never knew a lot about it. Unfortunately, my mom passed away a couple of years ago, but I grew up with these little books of Japanese, and I remember her talking about that. So that's very interesting that's part of what you discussed. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Okay, this lady right here.
You mentioned Halls Hill. I work at Marymount University, and probably most people here are familiar with the Rixey Mansion.
Yes.
On the grounds of the campus, which was built in 1920. But I just learned recently that the property on which Rixey Mansion was built was owned by Mary Ann Hall.
Yes.
And she owned the finest brothel in Washington.
Correct. And she's the sister of Basil Hall, for whom Halls Hill Plantation was named.
And she, the brothel was located at where I believe the National Museum of the American Indian is today.
Yeah.
And I went recently to Congressional Hill Cemetery.
Oh, and she's buried there?
Buried there.
Very good. Well, there's also some kind of memorial marker to her on the golf course. I read that recently, but I tried to get somebody who's a member of the club to confirm that, but they didn't. But yeah, that's a very...
Is a member, so I'll
Ask, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, Jim Allen here.
Anita and I bought our first house in 1965 in Horseshoe Park. And that's the name of the past because they've redone the park and named it something else. kind of like old Shirley Highway, doesn't exist anymore. But my son and I guess in about 67 or 68, were building a deck behind our house, and we had to do a lot of digging. And lo and behold, we dug up a mini ball, Civil War bullet. I understand there's a lot of ordnance throughout Arlington from the mini forts and during that period. And I understand there's only one battle that was fought in Arlington, such as it was. I think it was a cavalry encounter. So have you done any research or studied, I know you must have, on the Civil War and its impact on Arlington and things that happened here?
Well, I spoke to, I do have two chapters on the Civil War, one on the 40th and Allen, which is the site of James Madison Elementary School where I went, which is now a senior center. And they just opened the new outdoor museum there. I recommend it. I was there in March, right after it opened. There wasn't any serious combat in Arlington, though when we were kids, we would occasionally at James Madison find belt buckles or shell casings. And how many of you remember who Tom Lillingquist is? Yeah, very good. Yeah, he's a classmate of ours at Yorktown, and I grew up in his neighborhood. But he is the one who just gave the Library of Congress 2-3 years ago the Lillingquist collection of Civil War portraits on tintypes and other types of early photography, which he has collected. He's a wealthy jeweler. He runs Lillingquist and Beckstead out at Tyson's, and he and his sons have been collecting the Civil War portraits, and you can see them on the Library of Congress website. But he told me that he found casings when he was a boy, but that it's sort of denuded by now. I guess it's not within the law to use a metal detector today and go after them, but they've probably got them all. The other Civil War thing, I have a chapter on Mosby, who lived in Arlington, and I'm indebted to my first grade classmate, Catherine Holt Springston, who's a Cherrydale historian, for tracking down Mosby in later years. You know, he was the gray ghost in the Shenandoah Valley, and he performed all these raids and ran circles around the Union troops. But after the war, he and General Grant, who, when he was president, became friends, and Mosby did not wave the bloody shirt and keep the Civil War alive, and he got appointed to our consul in Hong Kong, and then he worked in the Interior Department in Washington. And for a while, he lived in a boarding house right at where the Fillmore Gardens are today in Columbia Pike. And then I have a chapter on George Dodge. Again, he shows up. He likes to dress up as a Confederate soldier who lived on the Abington Plantation in Arlington and owned slaves. He does an excellent talk in uniform on that. I mentioned Munson Hill a little bit in some of my talks. The Battle of Munson Hill, Munson Hill is right over at Route 7 and Glen Carlin Road. It's right where Jeb Stuart assembled his troops and got a promotion. It's interesting that Jeb Stuart High School, which is right near there off Sleepy Hollow, is named because Jeb Stuart was actually there, not just because he was a famous general. And Lincoln came out there too at Munson's Hill. But it was basically a fake battle. There was artificial armaments there on the hill that were designed to fool the binoculars of the Union troops, and not much happened at Munson Hill either. So. Any other questions? Yes, back here.
I've always been intrigued by the trolley. Did that go into Washington?
Yes. There's a picture of a trolley circling around and I think crashing at what is now Roslyn Circle in front of the Marriott, back when it was the Cherry Smash plant and a brewery, I think, before that. You know, there was what was called light rail went through Cherrydale and out Old Dominion Drive to McLean, and I'm sure that Catherine Springston would have a much firmer idea of the exact routes, but Cherrydale was one of the main stops. In fact, you mentioned Admiral Rixey, who gave the land, or sold the land. His address, I mentioned him in my treatment of Teddy Roosevelt riding his horse through Arlington, and Rixey was his riding partner, and President Roosevelt had rules for riding to keep the groupies and paparazzi from messing up the ride. And he talks about his dateline or signature mailing address, Admiral Rixey's, was called Cherrydale Station, even though it's, you know, it's a good half mile from today's Cherrydale, but that's how big Cherrydale was at the time, and it was there because it was a trolley stop.
Right, they have pictures of it at the Walmart on Wilson.
Oh, Walgreens, you mean? Walgreens, or is it a CVS?
No, it's Walgreens.
Okay.
Anyway, those pictures are very interesting, but they mislabeled the post office, and it says Arlington County Library.
Yes, very good point.
And it says post office right on the front of the dome.
Somebody pointed that out just the other night. I was there. Thank you for mentioning it. Famous typos. Okay, back here, in the very back here.
Yes, Arlington was originally part of the L'Enfant layout of the District of Columbia. The Virginia portion was, for the most part, ceded back to Virginia, and the border, the surveyed lines still remain the southern and western parts of Arlington County. At some point, way back when, stone surveying markers were laid out at different points along these borders. The only one of which that I know of remaining is on Jefferson Street,
Right.
just up from Columbia Pike as you head towards the Bailey's Crossroads and Route 7. I do remember seeing a second one up at what is now Upton Hill Regional Park, and I presume that was removed, and who knows where it was disposed of.
Well,
Are
I'll
you
tell you-
aware of any of these other markers
Yes,
and what's left?
they've all been surveyed. I think there were 64 of them or something. 40, he's saying. Okay, very good, thank you. And so John Kelly's column in the Post occasionally updates the adventures of a man who has tracked them all down. There's one near my house at Benjamin Baedeker Park, and Baedeker helped lay those out. And I also wanted to mention that some of them are in people's backyards, too. It's not even accessible to the public. If they build a streetcar, they're going to have to move that stone that's been there for 200 years. So that might be a reason to oppose a streetcar. I leave that to you. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to put a plug in. I read your column faithfully because you make subjects which normally I wouldn't tune into really come alive. And I wanted to compliment you on the 60th anniversary of the
Thanks, Uncle
speech for
Jim.
the Committee of 100. I won't mention any names because I don't want to
Thank
make
you.
this political. But the first house that I bought in Arlington in 1977 was built by an outfit I found out at closing called Conservative Realty. They don't seem to have had a great deal of influence based on voting patterns. But I wanted to raise another issue, and if there are people here from Lyon Village, evidently when Frank Lyon built Lyon Village, he bought a farm from somebody I think called Creed, and my house was on Barton Street, and we appear to be just one block outside of what was legitimately Lyon Village. But there was a rumor that the meeting house that's there was the first truth in advertising case in America, because evidently when he built this, he said, I'll build you a meeting house, and like most good developers after the war came, he thought, well, I'll get away with this, and somebody said, what about the meeting house? And they sued and prevailed. So I was wondering if anybody knows if this is an apocryphal story or a
Good
true
anecdote.
story.
And you're talking about Lyon Village, not
Lyon
Lyon
Village,
Park,
yeah.
right? Because they both have community houses.
Both have
That's
community houses,
yeah,
but
okay.
allegedly he did not want to follow through, and it's actually
You're saying
held
that's
in
true.
trust, I believe, today. It's not.
Jerry Laporte is nodding his head that it's true here.
Well,
You guys can talk after the show.
I was wondering, I understand the reason Arlington and Alexandria succeeded, so to speak, from the federal district in the late 1840s was concerned that Washington, D.C. was about ready to, the federal government in Washington, D.C. was about ready to abolish the slave trade
Slavery.
inside Washington, and the good folks didn't want to go out to, say, Fairfax Courthouse to buy and sell slaves.
That's a good question. I would have to read up on that. I do know that it was an economic decision, and Cornelia Rose talks about, she traced Nicholas Fabre as being the one who was a huge landowner in the sort of Wilson Boulevard area, and big Arlington family. She noted that he was one of the ones who voted to retrocede, but she couldn't explain why. You know, there's a book that I'm about to read whose author spoke here about 2 years ago on the history of Chain Bridge, and I've skimmed a little bit of it, and it's a pretty good economic history of the region, the big competition between Georgetown and Old Town Alexandria for ship trade, and I suspect that the retrocession was related to some of that too, the shipping. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Chain Bridge, I forget, third or fourth one. The chain is still down in the bottom of the Potomac River.
Oh. Good factoid.
Another thing, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Roslyn and how it has changed.
Sure.
Maybe the courthouse and how that has changed, and maybe a colonial village. I don't know how many specifics that you do talk about, you know,
Well,
subdivisions or whatever.
all of
Thank you
these
very
ring a
much.
bell. I mean, I can respond, you know, on the surface because I'm a superficial person, but no, Roslyn was notorious, and a lot of people know this, in the latter 19th and early 20th century for pawn shops and gambling dens and brothels. And there was a very interesting documentary on the history of Washington on public television about 6 or 8 years ago that talked about the fact that the farmers from Fairfax would ride their horse-drawn carts in to bring their produce to the downtown D.C. market, and they would need a security escort because they would get mugged and gunned down as they went through Roslyn. And, you know, Michael Lee Pope, whose book, I have his book called, same publisher as mine, called Alexandria, D.C., which deals a lot with retrocession, by the way. I did read it, but he has another book on the sheriff named Crandall Mackey. And it's funny, my wife and I went to some kind of 20s ball at the Artisphere in Roslyn, and the drink they served that night was the Crandall Mackey in his honor. But he busted up all these gambling dens and brothels and made a big name for himself, I think in the 20s and 30s. But Roslyn, you know, it's still has had its trouble with its identity, and it has trouble now with nightlife, and of course the Artisphere, which got some county money, $500,000 in county money, and is still struggling a little bit to achieve an identity. And the pawn shop, the main one, moved up to Lion Village, right near the Lion Village Community Center. And I just noticed that it got bought out. You know, I have a column in here on the National Pawnbrokers and how when I was a kid, we thought they were guitar gods who could tell you all about, you know, these old men who were pawnbrokers knew all about Gibson electric fretboards and stuff. We little did we know, we were 12 years old. But so I went into that pawn shop 3 years ago and decided I would solve this mystery of whether these characters really knew anything about rock and roll and guitars. It's sort of a joke column. But the National Pawnbrokers, since I interviewed him, has sold out to a place called Cash something. Anyway, it's a national chain. Just noticed it about a week ago. Yes, Melanie, yes.
What do you know about all the used car lots and the history of the used car lots, and where do you think they're headed at this point in Arlington's development?
Well, the only thing I can say about that is that Mario's Pizza, which I have a column on, is right next to about 4 used car lots, and they're all doomed. They're all, the whole strip between the Clarendon Metro and the Virginia Square Metro, all these developers have their eyes on it, and there's going to be high rises there and fancier hotels. Gourmet Pizza would probably replace Mario's, and there's still, I would say that might be the most used car lots in all of Arlington. It's probably right there in that 10th Street, Washington Boulevard, Wilson Boulevard convergence there. And I'm not sure how they make it, how often they make sales.
If you're doing research about Arlington County, going back to before 1950, you could be involving the geography of the county. You might be very confused to see references to Lee Boulevard. And you may think to yourself, is that what became Lee Highway? What's that? Well, the explanation is that Arlington Boulevard used to be called Lee Boulevard. We had Lee Highway and Lee Boulevard coexisting
Very good factoid.
in the county for I don't know how long. But in 1946, I began dating a gal that lived in Clarendon, and I noted the confusing situation because of the juxtaposition of those two streets. And I remember almost to the day when Lee Boulevard was renamed Arlington
Is
Boulevard.
that right?
Now called Route 50.
That's an excellent story. It reminds me of if you go to Atlanta, you can see the intersection of Peachtree, Peachtree, and Peachtree. You know, you just reminded me of a factoid about Wilson Boulevard had a compound name in the 19th century. I'll get most of it right. It's something like the Hampshire, Leesburg, Alexandria Turnpike or something. It became Wilson Boulevard after Woodrow Wilson, who came to its dedication, apparently. Yeah. All right, keep going. Let's see, this lady here.
Do you remember they had a miniature golf course? And they had a bowling alley. And so we would drive all the way to Arlington.
Is that right?
Anyway, I wish they'd bring that back.
Yeah. Well, somebody made a joke about that because there's a picture in the book of the Ballston skyline and the old putt-putt. And a friend of mine even gave me a ticket stub from the old putt-putt, 1964. But my friends have been joking that they're going to, because I just did a column on the plan to revamp Ballston, turn it into Ballston Center. A lot of big changes in store there. And somebody said, well, of course they'll bring back the putt-putt. So. Okay, yes, right here.
I grew up in D.C., so this is not a historical factoid. But I am just amazed at all of the brand new, beautiful, slowly but surely, schools in Arlington County. I wonder if that's unusual, whether our son is now in Brooklyn, has been for a number of years, and he comes down here and says, my God, this must be a really rich county. And I don't know how unusual that is to build every school. Build every school.
Well,
almost every school.
I'm sure the educators here are pleased to hear that. In 1950, I believe it's 57, maybe 8, Life magazine did a profile of Arlington schools in which they said they were among the best in the nation, whatever. There was a lot of post-World War II effort to build good schools. And I do have a chapter in my book interviewing with Martha Ann Miller. How many have gotten her book, too? Very nice, yeah. She's 103 years old and spent the last 70 of those years in Arlington and self-published her autobiography about 2 years ago. And I've met her, and I used her anecdotes about the integration of Stratford Junior High, where she was a teacher. She was a home ec teacher at the time. But she talks a lot about how they had to fight the bird machine in Richmond to, Arlingtonians for a Better County was formed in the late 40s, and there was these progressive groups, Arlingtonians for Better Schools, I think was one of the groups. And it was a matter of funding. It was a low priority for the downstate people, and the people in Northern Virginia were arguing for big percentage increases. So, okay, we got 2 more right there. Vivian, yes.
Speaking of the fight for integration of the schools, as I look at the contents, it seems to me you've avoided a very rich field, namely the politics of Arlington, the people who came in during the Depression and the Roosevelt New Deal, and then the post-war period versus the old line bird people. Was there a conscious reason to just skirt that whole area?
No, I'll get to it if there's a volume 2.
Okay.
One thing I do mention that, Vivian, you just reminded me, is that the Northern Virginia Sun, I have a whole column on the Northern Virginia Sun, which I used to get when I was a kid, and Herman Obermeyer, who's still living at age 90, and he and I are working together on some research projects about the American Nazi Party, because Herman was a player in that drama. You know, he ran the Sun, and he thought that the Nazis ought to be covered and exposed rather than ignored, which is what a lot of the other newspapers had decided to do because the Nazis were such publicity hounds. But Herman is a conservative, and he bought the Northern Virginia Sun in 1959 or 60 from these New Deal types, and that's what he calls them. And they were trying to set it up in Arlington as a pro-Roosevelt kind of publication, and he flip that around. So I'll get to it, Vivian. Thanks. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The garage in Roslyn where Woodward met with Mark Felt all those years ago, was there ever any impetus to make it a national landmark? And what area, what spot in Arlington for you should be a landmark, should be known, but isn't by people who don't live in this area, people who haven't grown up in Arlington?
Well, that's a good question. I did read that the decision was made just 6 weeks ago to tear down that parking lot where Bob Woodward met Mark Felt, his FBI secret source. And the builder who's going to build a high-rise has promised to commemorate it with some kind of plaque. I don't think he's decided on the details. What would be missing from Arlington? I don't know, perhaps a little more on slavery. You know, there were slaves in Arlington. It shows up in all the census records. And I have a piece coming out in the Arlington Historical Magazine for next year on the Birch family, and that goes into that a little bit. You know, the fact that the internet got its start in Arlington is something that I'm very proud of, and that it was another series of flukes you know, Al Gore was mocked for allegedly saying he invented the internet, but Al Gore lived in Arlington, you know, and the real internet was indeed invented in Arlington, and there's a historic sign there in Roslyn, and I have a picture of it in the book. And again, I've driven in cars with people who just go right by it and don't even notice it. The ARPANET was right there, Wilson and 14th or whatever. You know.
I'm wondering if you've come across the name of Roscoe Richards, who was known in, I believe, the 1950s, maybe the very early 60s, as the sort of unofficial mayor of Halls Hill. He owned a huge tract of land near Yorktown High School, around Harrison Street, 27th. It was a farm when I, with my parents, moved into our house in 1960. And, of course, houses were built on that land in 1964. But Roscoe Richards, does that name ring any bells?
No, but I would love to look into that, Mark. It's a good idea.
He was, I believe, either the son or the grandson of slaves in Arlington.
Very good. Okay, Jerry Laporte, and then we'll take a break, and I'm happy to be over here signing books, and we can chat one-on-one.
Just following up on the discussion that you had about the Woodward and Bernstein and the historical marker that sits there at the garage, if you pay close attention to that historical marker, which may or may not come back and be placed when they build a new garage there, but the marker doesn't mention the words deep throat.
No, okay? It doesn't.
And the reason for that is that the Arlington Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board had a debate.
She's on.
Had a debate as to whether the words deep throat should be mentioned on the historical marker. And the vote, there was a recorded vote, I think it was like 7 to 8 or something like that.
That is a great factoid, Jerry.
And the people who didn't want deep throat won the vote. So the current historical marker does not mention those words.
Thank you for that. Well, listen, I enjoyed this very much, you all. Thank you for turning out. Yeah.